And she's a very meticulous person, you know, like these people. It's just like she'd fit into your group very well. She'd be very happy with her. But everything is perfect. Her undergarments, what is nice, sometimes referred to as panties, are folded, perfect, wrapped. They're like so perfect. I said, that's beautiful. You know, it's the part of the world she came from. Everything was perfect, no problem. Fold, fold, fold. I think that she steams them, make sure. Just that we came home. I wasn't there when the raid took place. A raid of a popular president, a former president. She opened the drawers and it was not that way. They were a mess. It was all over the place. And she said, oh, what happened? That's so terrible. But it's terrible. That went into my young boy's room.
You just watched that, and there is no preparing for what we have become. There is no mental architecture to contain the spectacle of democratic collapse when it arrives in the form of a 79-year-old man standing before thousands of cheering Americans, explaining in granular detail that his wife steams her panties, and that federal law enforcement agents are thugs who are disgusting, and that we have to do something about it, because this is where we are now. This is the terminus of decades of conservative movement building. This is what happens when the politics of white grievance and authoritarian impulse, the utter annihilation of democratic norms, meets the raw, unfiltered eye of a man who has never in his entire life been told no by anyone who mattered to him, and who now wields the power of American fascism like a sword aimed directly at the throat of the republic itself. And you need to understand something crucial right now, because what comes next matters more than anything. Trump relitigated the 2020 election at this North Carolina rally, complaining at length about the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago, including what happened to First Lady Melania Trump's underwear drawer. And this wasn't some off-the-cuff moment of confusion or cognitive decline. This was strategic in the most chilling way imaginable, because Trump understands that the degradation of political discourse is itself a weapon, that if you can make people numb to the absurdity, then you can make them numb to the atrocity that inevitably follows. The FBI search at Mar-a-Lago was not some random harassment campaign. Let's be extraordinarily clear about the factual predicate here, because context is everything when we're talking about authoritarian rhetoric masquerading as victimhood. Over 13,000 government documents were recovered, including nuclear-related information and FBI, CIA, and NSA information about national security interests, with 337 classified documents among them. A handful of documents found by the FBI at Mar-a-Lago were so sensitive that even a senior Justice Department official didn't have authorization to see them, with investigators describing gravely serious material. This wasn't a raid, it was the lawful execution of a search warrant to retrieve stolen classified material that posed genuine threats to American national security. A grand jury indicted Trump on 37 felony counts related to his mishandling and withholding of the records before a Trump-appointed federal judge dismissed it on questionable legal grounds. So when Trump transforms that legitimate law enforcement action into a pornographic grievance narrative about perfectly folded undergarments and steam-pressed panties, what he's doing is taking the single most serious breach of classified document protocols in modern American history and turning it into a culture war rallying cry. He's taking his own criminal exposure and weaponizing it through the language of sexual humiliation and xenophobic coding about his Slovenian wife's obsessive European tidiness and transforming accountability into persecution. But here's the part that should terrify every single person who cares about the survival of democratic governance in this country, and I need you to truly hear this because we're running out of time to sound the alarm. Trump frequently promised to exact retribution against perceived political enemies throughout his 2024 campaign, with retribution being a central campaign theme for his second presidential bid. The former president's theme of retribution, which has roots in old Confederate code, first emerged at last year's Conservative Political Action Conference when he declared, "I am your warrior, I am your justice, and for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution." This isn't rhetoric, this is promise, this is contract, this is the authoritarian playbook being read aloud in real time. An expert who studies authoritarianism said Trump's rhetoric about criminalizing dissent is familiar and carries serious implications, noting this is out of the autocratic playbook. As autocrats consolidate their power once they're in office, anything that threatens their power or exposes their corruption or releases information that's harmful to them in any way becomes illegal, comparing it to what Orban does, Modi is doing, and Putin has long done. When Trump stands on that stage and calls FBI agents thugs for executing a lawful search warrant, when he promises that we have all the evidence now and that we have to do something about it, He is not engaging in political hyperbole. He is rehearsing the purge that scholars of democratic backsliding have been warning us about for years. Think about the cognitive violence being performed here, because this matters for understanding how authoritarianism entrenches itself through spectacle and distraction, and the deliberate confusion of victim and victimizer. Trump is now the sitting president again after winning in 2024, but he returned to the years-old raid while making a stop in North Carolina for a rally-style speech, ostensibly about the economy, on his way to Mar-a-Lago for a 2-week Christmas vacation, as the president hopes to refocus the nation's attention on his economic record ahead of next year's critical midterm elections. It was another reminder that his own focus often remains somewhat adrift. This was supposed to be an economic speech, and instead we got extended meditations on Melania's lingerie organization system. We got a woman in the crowd covering her face as she cringed, while the President of the United States mimed the difference between dresser drawers and underwear garments. We got people in the crowd beginning to walk out as Trump's speech passed the 1-hour mark, with some rallygoers on stage behind the MAGA leader leaving the stage as Trump continued to speak for nearly 90 minutes. And yet the crowd that remained cheered. They applauded. They roared their approval when he promised retribution against these so-called thugs. And that's the point. That's always been the point. The cruelty and the degradation, and the fundamental unseriousness is the strategy, because it normalizes the authoritarian impulse underneath. Trump blasted the raid as illegal and disgusting, alleging agents searched through his wife's panties drawer, saying I was the hunted, I had these animals trying to attack me at Mar-a-Lago. Animals. Thugs. The language here is not accidental. This is the rhetoric of dehumanization. This is how you prepare a political base to accept extra-legal violence against law enforcement. This is how you transform the rule of law into an enemy conspiracy. Trump has threatened prosecutors, some judges, courtroom staff, and even a grand juror involved in his criminal and civil cases, and has also said election workers, journalists, and private citizens who criticize the Supreme Court should be jailed. This is not normal political discourse. This is not the usual partisan sparring between left and right. Over the last 2.5 decades, the GOP has mutated from a traditional conservative party into an insurgent force that threatens the norms and institutions of American democracy, and it now displays characteristics of what scholars of comparative politics call an anti-system party, one that seeks to foment tribalism, distort elections, and subvert political institutions and norms, tendencies that appeared well before Trump's election, but have grown only stronger under his presidency. Let's talk about what Trump is actually threatening when he says we have to do something about it, because the vagueness is part of the menace, but the blueprint is already written and publicly available. During his second presidency, the Trump administration took a series of actions using the government to target his political opponents and civil society, described by news outlets as part of his promised retribution and revenge campaign. Undertaking a massive expansion of presidential power under a maximalist interpretation of the unitary executive theory, with several actions ignoring or violating federal laws, regulations, and the Constitution. In late November 2025, 10 months into his second presidency, Reuters counted 470 people, organizations, and institutions that Trump had already targeted for retribution. Read that again. 470 targets of presidential retaliation. This is not a thought experiment. This is not a hypothetical concern about what Trump might do. He threatened, signed executive actions, and ordered investigations into his political opponents, critics, and organizations aligned with the Democratic Party, and the PANTIES rant is the circus that keeps you distracted while the apparatus of authoritarian state control gets constructed in the shadows. And we have to understand the historical lineage of this moment, because nothing happens in a vacuum, and the Republican Party's descent into authoritarian politics didn't begin with Trump, even though he has turbocharged and weaponized and given full permission structure to impulses that were already simmering beneath the surface for generations. The transformation of the Republican Party, from a recognizable center-right conservative political party to what it has become under Donald Trump, began a half-century ago, starting with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy to break the old Democratic Solid South by capturing white voters angered by the civil rights movement, and 2 generations have passed with the South becoming solidly Republican. The economic conservatism of an earlier generation of Republicans has become more extreme and is now fused with moral fervor by the promotion of culture wars in close alliance with the religious right, and Trump may have executed a hostile takeover of the GOP, but the party has been laying the groundwork for decades, and most of its leaders and base have passionately embraced him. Recently, the party has not only shed whatever commitment it may have once held for democracy, but appears intent on promoting a distinctly anti-democratic, if not qualitatively fascist, political agenda, and what the Tennessee Republicans did was not a blunder or an overreach, it was a test case. The spectacle of Trump's rally performances serves multiple authoritarian functions simultaneously, and we need to be clear-eyed about the political science here, because dismissing this as mere buffoonery or cognitive decline misses the strategic architecture underneath. A Trump rally has the feel of an all-day pep rally mixed with a megachurch service, except with Trumpism as the religion, places where a movement largely defined by grievance can be together, away from opponents, places to see that for many Americans, Trumpism isn't just about politics, it's a core part of their identities. A core feature of the former president's populist rhetoric was his defiance of norms of political speech, and according to scholars, Trump spoke with an irreverent, improvised and unencumbered brashness that suggests that he is saying out loud what everyone else is too afraid to say, though breaking rhetorical norms can be seen as proof of authenticity, but if taken too far it can lead to ridicule. But here's the crucial mechanism. The populist overtones bore parallels to authoritarian leaders, and the former president's rhetoric was unprecedentedly vitriolic and extreme to the point that some scholars and journalists labeled it as fascist, comparable to that of Juan Perón, Fidel Castro, and Adolf Hitler. The Panties rant isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's the deliberate weaponization of transgressive behavior to test boundaries and acclimate audiences to accept progressively more extreme violations of democratic norms. The offending comments were not altogether out of place in the context of a Trump rally, where the use of crude slogans, explicit anthems from Kid Rock, and offensive nicknames for political opponents has been the norm. Every boundary crossed without consequence becomes the new baseline. Every act of degradation that goes unpunished becomes permission for the next escalation, and what we're watching in real time is the systematic desensitization of a political movement to authoritarian rule through the medium of spectacle and sexual humiliation and racialized grievance, all wrapped in the flag, and sanctified by the movement's quasi-religious devotion to their strongman leader. A Donald Trump rally is a freewheeling extravaganza, a festival of grievance and retribution, a dystopian vision of darkness and despair, and it is working exactly as designed, because many voters don't seem to mind or have grown so accustomed to the extreme nature of his rhetoric that it has just been tuned out. Let me spell out what the stakes actually are here, because we're talking about the survival of constitutional democracy in the United States, and this is not hyperbole. This is the sober assessment of scholars who study democratic backsliding and authoritarian consolidation across comparative political systems. Philion Bassin, an expert on authoritarian movements with the group Protect Democracy, says that Trump's threats could endanger American civil liberties, stating this is how autocrats cement their permanent grip on power. When asked if Trump could tell the Justice Department to go after all the people he's threatened, Bassin says the answer is essentially yes, noting there are not really legal restrictions or even structural restrictions that would stop the president from simply directing them to go and investigate his perceived opponents. Some of Trump's allies have promised to undo the decades-long custom that the White House stays out of the Justice Department's decision-making, with former Trump administration official Russell Vought saying, "The Department of Justice is not an independent agency, and if anyone brings it up in a policy meeting in the White House, I want them out of the meeting." This is the endgame. This is the plan. This is what we're careening toward, while Trump distracts the national conversation with extended riffs about whether his wife steams her underwear, and after the 2020 election, the sitting president attempted to subvert the results and remain in office. But democratic erosion in the United States is not synonymous with Donald Trump, as since 2010, state legislatures have instituted laws intended to reduce voters' access to the ballot, politicize election administration, and foreclose electoral competition via extreme gerrymandering. Partisan polarization has a minimal role in explaining states' democratic backsliding, but Republican control of state government dramatically reduces states' democratic performance, with survey research demonstrating that ethnic antagonism has eroded Republicans' commitment to democracy. The through line from the Southern strategy to the Tea Party to Trump to January 6th to the classified documents to the Panties rant to the threats against FBI agents is not a series of disconnected incidents. It is the coherent trajectory of a political party that has decided democratic governance is an obstacle to permanent minority rule and is willing to burn down the entire system to maintain power. And here's what makes this particular moment so dangerous, and why the frivolity of the spectacle is actually its most sinister element. The government launched 2 federal probes into Trump for his handling of classified documents and his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, and Trump has demanded the Justice Department pay him $230 million in compensation over the federal investigations after he left office, submitting a complaint for each probe through an administrative claim process. Think about the audacity here. Think about the sheer autocratic chutzpah of a man who stole classified documents, obstructed their return, got indicted for it, saw the case dismissed by a judge he appointed, and is now demanding $250 million in compensation from the very government he betrayed, and he's making this demand while joking about his wife's perfectly steamed panties to a crowd of thousands who cheer him on. This is kleptocracy meeting authoritarianism, meeting the total collapse of shame or accountability, or any remaining democratic guardrails. He's also threatened to jail election workers, pledged to take on the civil service, and to enact retribution on political enemies if elected, all of which would significantly stretch the normal limits of executive power. The Republican Party is not going to save us from this. Let's be extraordinarily clear about that, because the evidence is overwhelming and incontrovertible. Across the country, from Tennessee to Montana, Republican-controlled state legislatures are quietly and effectively eroding democracy on a near-daily basis, amassing outsized power, enabling them to push a radical agenda, including expelling and silencing elected leaders, banning abortion, loosening gun laws, targeting trans families, and banning books, as too many Republican-controlled legislatures have gone from opposing Democrats to opposing democracy itself. The Republican Party is the biggest threat to American democracy today, as it is a radical obstructionist faction that has become hostile to the most basic democratic norm, that the other side should get to wield power when it wins elections. As this path toward anti-democratic attitudes and behavior gains steam, Republican leaders and voters are routinely expressing support for what can certainly be described as autocracy, or even worse, fascism, and this has reached a crisis point as the party is now led, indeed dominated, by one man, Donald Trump, with loud and enthusiastic support from the MAGA movement, added to the acquiescence of Republican political leaders and voters throughout the country to this thoroughly dangerous brand of politics. What Trump did at that rally was not a gaffe. It was not a senior moment. It was not the rambling of a man losing his cognitive edge, though elements of all those things may be present. What Trump did was perform the script of authoritarian consolidation that political scientists have been documenting across Hungary and Poland and Turkey and the Philippines and Venezuela for decades. In leaked audio from Tennessee Republicans, State Rep Scott Sepicki spoke of moves against Democratic legislators as a salvo in an existential war for the country, saying, "If you don't believe we're at war for our republic, with all love and respect for you, you need a different job, and the left want Tennessee so bad, because if they get us, the Southeast falls and it's game over for the Republic." And with this apocalyptic thinking, Republicans have convinced themselves that their grabs for power are necessary tactics furthering a righteous cause, framing themselves as the last defenders of the country, justifying any and all tactics to achieve victory, even a Pyrrhic victory that destroys the democracy it claims to defend. The function of the underwear digression is to flood the zone with absurdity, so that the threat hiding beneath becomes invisible, or dismissible, or just another Trumpism that his supporters love and his detractors clutch their pearls about, while nothing fundamentally changes. But things are changing. They have already changed. Trump's actions against the media and those who expressed certain viewpoints were described as negatively impacting free speech and as unprecedented in modern American history, mirroring tactics used by authoritarian leaders, and he criticized and fired officials who reported facts, statistics, and analysis that went against his opinions, ordering them removed or redone to suit his preferences, with scientists expressing fear of expressing viewpoints contrary to administration preferences. This is happening right now. This is not theoretical. This is not alarmism. This is the documented record of a president who has already begun dismantling democratic accountability and using the power of the state to persecute his enemies, while his lawyers argue in federal court that Trump has called for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution, to put him back into office, stated that the President of the United States must have full immunity from all actions taken in office, and his lawyers even argued in court that the President could legally order the assassination of his political adversaries and still be protected by immunity. We are past the point of being able to laugh this off or dismiss it as political theater, or assume that institutions will hold, because institutions are made of people, and people are susceptible to coercion and corruption, and the normalizing effects of authoritarian creep. The GOP has turned to a polarizing and counter-majoritarian strategy precisely because it knows that it is in a race against time. Every election cycle, as the party's older white voting base shrinks as a share of the electorate, Republicans' revanchism appeals to fewer and fewer Americans, and the party's rhetoric conjures up a mythical past because the GOP as currently constituted cannot survive in a democratic future. This is the context for understanding why Trump is so dangerous. He represents the last gasp of white Christian nationalist minority rule in a diversifying democracy, and rather than adapt to demographic and cultural change, the movement has decided to end democracy itself, and they're doing it while Trump entertains the crowd with stories about Melania's meticulously organized intimates. The call to action here cannot be clearer, and the urgency cannot be overstated, because we are living through a hinge moment in American history where the choices we make in our next few years will determine whether constitutional democracy survives or whether we descend into a form of electoral autocracy that maintains the aesthetic trappings of democracy while gutting its substance entirely. The electoral road to breakdown is dangerously deceptive, as people still vote. Elected autocrats maintain a veneer of democracy while eviscerating its substance, and many government efforts to subvert democracy are legal in the sense that they are approved by the legislature or accepted by the courts, with political scientists describing this phenomenon as democratic erosion, democratic backsliding, democratic regression, and autocratization. Trump's promise that we have to do something about the FBI agents who executed a lawful search warrant is a promise to purge law enforcement of anyone who would dare hold him accountable. We can expect a lot more political maneuvers as outrageous and diabolically creative as Tennessee's expulsion of Democratic lawmakers. And fortunately, this war footing appears to be the perspective of only a minority of Americans, although it seems to be growing within the GOP, and having seen the dangers of this thinking play out through illegal acts like the January 6 insurrection, it is important for any true defenders of American democracy to recognize that it is equally pernicious when the Republican save our country at any cost mindset operates within the current boundaries of American democracy in order to tear those boundaries down. This is not a drill. This is not hyperbole. This is not Trump derangement syndrome or liberal hysteria or any of the other dismissive terms that get deployed to silence legitimate alarm about authoritarian consolidation. The party of Abraham Lincoln, who dedicated his life so the government of the people, by the people, and for the people should not perish, has become under Donald Trump the greatest threat to American democracy since the Civil War, and he has released the demons from their dark corners, and it won't be easy to shut the doors again. The PANTIES rant is the canary in the coal mine. It's the indicator species for democratic collapse. It's the moment when you realize that nothing is too absurd, nothing is too degrading, nothing is too openly authoritarian for this movement, because they have transcended shame and accountability entirely in service of power for its own sake. And when Trump promises retribution against the thugs who dared to enforce the law against him, when his crowds cheer for that retribution, when his party enables it, and his media ecosystem amplifies it, and his donors fund it, and his voters reward it, we are witnessing the final stages of a democratic system eating itself from within while performing the death throes as entertainment. The resistance to this cannot be passive observation or resigned acceptance or cynical detachment that assumes all politicians are equally corrupt and all systems equally broken, because that is precisely the mindset that authoritarian movements depend upon to succeed. Apathy is complicity, both sidesism is capitulation, and the failure to recognize the unprecedented nature of this threat is itself a form of collaboration with democratic collapse. We need mass mobilization. We need sustained resistance. We need to rebuild democratic institutions and norms from the ground up. We need to confront the reality that the United States has seen substantial expansions of executive power and serious efforts to erode the independence of the civil service, and against these pressures, the gridlocked and hyper-partisan Congress is poorly equipped to provide unbiased oversight and accountability of the executive, with serious questions about the impartiality of the judiciary. The cavalry is not coming. The institutions will not save us automatically. This requires collective action and moral courage, and the willingness to name what we're witnessing without flinching or equivocating, because the stakes are literally the survival of self-governance in the United States. So yes, Trump ranted about Melania's panties, and yes, it was grotesque and humiliating and absurd, and yes, it was also a deliberate performance of authoritarian power that announced to his supporters that no norm remains sacred, no boundary will be respected, no democratic principle will stand between him and his promised retribution against everyone he deems an enemy, and that includes you if you dare to believe that law enforcement should apply to the powerful, that classified documents matter, that elections should be free and fair, that the rule of law means something more than the rule of Trump. This is the fight of our lives, and the fact that it's being waged through the medium of underwear anecdotes and fascist threats delivered with a showman's timing to arena crowds should not for 1 second diminish the existential nature of what we're facing. Democracy dies in spectacle just as surely as it dies in darkness, and we are watching it happen in real time while the crowd cheers and people walk out exhausted, and the president promises to do something about the thugs who dared to hold him accountable, and every single one of us has to decide right now whether we're going to fight like hell to stop this, or whether we're going to let the republic burn while Trump entertains us with stories about perfectly steamed panties. The choice could not be clearer, and the time for choosing is running out.